I gave this presentation about orchids to my local gardening group, and I decided to turn it into a video. It's a good introduction to growing orchids, and stay tuned at the end because there's a really good Q&A discussion after that. So let me give you a little background information about me. I got interested in orchids back when I was in university, and I've been growing them for over 40 years. At one point I had over 1,000 orchids in the house. I was a bit nuts over them, so I know a little bit about orchids. Today we're going to talk about them in a general sense, give you some background information about them. We'll go through some interesting facts about orchids, and then we'll get into the culture of orchids, which I know that's the part most people are interested in. And then at the end, we'll go through a series of different types of orchids and give you a little very quick overview on those. Orchid types. Well, let's start with the ones nobody ever thinks about, and these are terrestrial orchids. So they grow in Ontario. By the way, Guelph is located in Ontario if you're joining in from somewhere else around the world. We have quite a few orchids growing in the province. Most of them most people have never seen. This Cypripedium is fairly easy to find. In fact, I can find it around Guelph when I'm riding my bike out in the country. It usually grows in fairly wet spots. These are orchids that grow in the ground, and almost everything we're going to say today doesn't apply to these. The reason is that these are garden plants. They're not really grown inside the home, and they're not something that are easy to get a hold of. So orchids are epiphytes, so they grow on trees, and this is quite a good picture here. You can see all the roots climbing up and down the trunks, and they hold on to the trunks, and the orchids basically hang from those roots. And those roots are exposed to a lot of air. They're exposed to sunlight, and they dry out pretty quickly. I mean, that's their life. They grow in both warm and cold areas, but none of them grow in very cold areas. So in Canada, we don't have any epiphytes. In fact, in North America, I don't think there are any epiphytes except maybe in Florida, where I know they exist. So this is what we typically have in the home. This is a common Phalaenopsis. It's the most common plant people grow. And we can see some roots here. We can see the leaves growing. And so this is how we grow them in the home, because it's just too difficult to try to grow them on a tree in the home. So this is, if you like, our homegrown tree. But this is the same kind of plant, and it would grow in nature on trees. This is what the flowers look like. And the Phalaenopsis, the phals, they're the most popular orchid around. They're the ones you find in the grocery stores now, and in the home hardware and home development places. They become really popular house plants, largely because they're very interesting plants, and also because the price of these has dropped tremendously over the last 30 years or so. You might not recognize this orchid, but this is the vanilla orchid. So the vanilla beans are the seed pods from an orchid. Now, you can grow this in the house, but it grows as a large vine and is very difficult to actually grow without lots of light. So it's this tall, 10-foot tall thing before it flowers, and then it'll make these seed pods. But the vanilla you have is actually from an orchid. There are over 20,000 species of orchids. There are more orchid species than any other plant group. So when we're talking about orchids and how to grow them and so on, there are lots of exceptions. And I'm going to focus mostly on the things that apply to homeowners. This is an interesting orchid that you see quite a bit online, and people post pictures and people think it's faked and it's AI made and so on. But this is in fact a real orchid. The flower looks just like that, a little monkey's face. This one is actually fairly tricky to grow, but it can be grown in the home. There are lots of hybrids. So what's interesting about orchids is the way they cross-pollinate. So if we look at most plant species, you get cross-pollination within a genus, but plants rarely cross-pollinate with plants outside of that genus. But with orchids, that rule doesn't apply. And in fact, orchids cross-pollinate the genus quite frequently. So we're able to create all these new kinds of genus, which are hybrids of the previous genus. And so there's just dozens and dozens of new types of hybrids that are available. And in fact, there's more hybrids now available than actual species. It's a great place to play around if you like to hybridize things, except for one thing, it's a very slow process. So right now I'm growing a lot of streptocarpus, and I can cross-pollinate them today, and in 6 months from now I can have seedlings from that effort. Well, maybe say 8 months from now. With orchids, it could easily take 5 years before I see them bloom. They're very long-lived. Most of these orchids, if you bought one today, you took care of it, you grew it properly, it would outlast you. They're very, very long-lived plants. And they're actually fairly easy to take care of. I know people have a hard time with orchids, and it's really kind of a shame because they really are one of the easiest plants to grow in the home. Now, you do want to pick the right ones, and I'm going to help you with that. But once you have one, if you follow some really basic rules, they will grow well, they will flower every year, and it's the only houseplant I know of that can flower 12 months of the year, every year. Now, normally that doesn't happen, but if you pick the right ones, you can actually flower that long. Now, one of the things that is always asked is, well, do you need a greenhouse? And the answer to that is no. Orchids would love a greenhouse because greenhouse would give them more light, which they generally like. It gives them a very humid environment compared to our homes, and they like that as well. So a greenhouse is a perfect place to grow them, but you don't need them. You can grow many orchids in the house. All right, so they grow different ways, and there's two general methods of growing here. This is called sympodial. This plant here is, let's see, 3, 5, 6 years of growth is shown in this diagram. And if you look at the very far right, you'll see a small tip starting to grow. That's the current growth. Now we move back to the left, and the next set of leaves, that was grown earlier this year, and it hasn't flowered yet, so it should flower soon. If we move back a little farther to the left, we see another growth, and this one is in flower. And if we go farther back, we see older and older leaves. And in fact, the leaf part is really the top part, and then the bottom part is something called a pseudobulb. It's not really a bulb, it's more a thickening of the stem, but it holds a lot of nutrients and moisture and so on. And you get this pseudobulb growing, and then the leaves come out of the top. But on a plant like this, these leaves can be 5, 6 years old before they're too old and they start falling off the plant. The growth pattern is this long linear type of growth, which is very common in some of our perennials as well, the ones that are with rhizomes. So they make this rhizome and some growth, and a rhizome and some growth. The only difference is that in most sympodial orchids, you get one growth a year. So it's a very slow process. The other growth pattern is monopodial. So this means that there's one growth. So we have a pot here, and the growth is straight up, and you see this layer of leaves coming, and the plant will make a set of leaves, grow a little higher, make another set of leaves, grow a little higher, make another set of leaves, and so on. And it basically grows straight up. And this is the way Phalaenopsis grow. They don't grow sideways. So this plant could be 50 years old, and it's still going to be growing in the same size pot as it is today because it never gets any bigger at the bottom. It just grows straight up. All right, so I don't know if you guys like growing things from seed, but if you've never tried it, give it a try. There's nothing as magical as growing a new plant that you've never seen from seed. And I've grown literally a couple thousand different species of plants from seed, and I really enjoy it because I get to see a plant that I've never seen before, that may not even grow in my province, and yet I can import seed and grow it. If you want to start with orchids, I highly recommend you don't do that. Growing orchids from seed is quite tricky. So on the left there, you see a seed pod. It's open. The seeds are extremely tiny, and the seed itself has almost no food in it. So there's only enough food there to sort of make the first little bit of root and starts growing a little bit of leaf, and then the food's gone. And orchids have to be fed right away. They don't grow in soil, right? In nature, they would be germinating on a tree branch somewhere. There's very little food there. So when we do this in culture, we actually use little jars, and they're sterile inside. And that brown liquid at the bottom is a special nutrient mixture. So we have to feed these orchids right away. And they grow in this sterile condition for a number of years before we take them out and put them in pots. So as I said before, this is a slow process. I've never actually tried orchids that way. I just never had the patience to wait 5 years, but I have started them this way. So you can buy seedlings in jars. So this is a similar jar to what you just seen, except now the plants are much larger. These are anywhere from 2 to 3 years old. You can see some roots in there. They're still growing in this media, but now they're large enough that we can take them out of this special environment, pot them up, and grow them, and they'll do just fine. Again, not really the thing to do if you're a beginner grower, but it's kind of fun doing this because you have no idea what color of orchid you're going to get out of this. If the cross was made between two different colored orchids, you could get a wide range of different colors and shapes of flowers and so on. So every one of these are going to be unique and different. So that's the fun part. Most of you are going to go out and buy a plant and grow it that way. And that's what I would certainly recommend. So why do people have problems growing orchids? The single biggest problem with orchids is watering them. And it's actually really easy. It's actually one of the easiest things about orchids. So what I do with my orchids is I have them sitting wherever they are, on a windowsill or under lights, and I just leave them alone. I basically ignore them. Once the pot is fully dry, so there's no moisture in it, I'll take that pot, and the best way is to sink it in a pot of water like this. Rather than just pouring water in the top, just put it in a bucket, put it in the sink, put it somewhere in an outer pot, if you like, that doesn't have holes in the bottom. It needs to sit in water. And what I used to do is take these plants, take them to the kitchen sink, set them in water, go have my breakfast. So there's 15, 20 minutes. When I'm finished my breakfast, I clean up and I take the plant out of the water, and it's good for a week and a half, 2 weeks before I have to water it again. So we water very thoroughly when we water, and then we leave it alone until it's perfectly dry. And if you do that with most of the orchids that you're going to find, they grow just fine. You never have root rot. You don't have any problems with the orchids. If you forget to water them for 2-3 days, don't worry about it. I'm going to give you an example shortly that you just won't believe. But they're just fine, completely dry. The problem is people like to fuss over them. So people will come along and they'll water them, and then 3 days later they water them again and they water them again. Orchid roots have to dry out. And if you let them do that, the rest of growing them is really simple. So here's a little experiment. So I was telling people this for years, and I've given quite a few talks about orchids, and I kept saying, oh, you can, forget it. Go on holidays, come back. They'll be fine. And one day I thought, well, I keep telling people this, but I don't actually know if that's right. So let me sacrifice an orchid and see what happens. So I took this particular orchid, this is a Phalaenopsis, and I took it out of the pot. I took all the media off and set it on my desk. That's it. I just left it. Okay. No water, no misting, no nothing. It just literally sat on my desk. This is day 24. Okay. Now, if you look at it, it's making a new leaf. The two leaves below that look pretty good. Okay. The leaves below that, they're starting to look a little wrinkled. When they get wrinkled like that, it means they're losing too much moisture. Some of the roots are not looking so great, but some of the roots are just fine. And those green tips on the roots show that the roots are growing. So this orchid is making roots, is making new leaves, and it hasn't been watered in 24 days. Here's day 48. Same orchid, still has not been watered. And it doesn't look quite so good now. So the older leaves are starting to fall off. They're really dry. Even the upper leaves are starting to show a bit of wrinkling. But okay, we're 48 days into this experiment. Okay, you could go on holidays, come back, and this is the worst you'll have. And if you water this orchid, it will be fine. In fact, I was going on holidays for 2 weeks and I felt really sorry for it. So I finally potted it up. And this is day 94. So it's been in this pot for a little while. It's been watered properly. The leaves are recovered. It's growing really well. Perfectly healthy plant. Okay. The secret is don't water so much. Okay. If in doubt, leave it. You can leave it an extra week. It won't kill the plant. All right, let's talk about fertilizer. So there's special orchid fertilizer on the market. Well, I have news for you. There is no such thing. There is in the minds of the companies making this product, and there is in the minds of people who buy the product, but there is no such thing as orchid fertilizer. And in fact, there's no such thing as rose fertilizer or houseplant fertilizer or any of these other special fertilizers. All our plants use exactly the same nutrients. And if you compare all those fertilizers and look at the ingredients, you'll see they all have the same ingredients. Okay? There is no such thing as plant-specific fertilizer. They have the basic nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. They may have micronutrients. There's some listed there, iron, copper, manganese, molybdenum, zinc. They all have the same nutrients. So what you want to find is a water-soluble fertilizer that has micronutrients. Make sure we give them those. And has an NPK ratio of 3:1:2. So those are the three numbers there. So this particular brand is a 30-10-10. The first number is the nitrogen, the second number is the phosphorus, and the third number is the potassium. Now this ratio is a 3:1:1, right? 30-10-10. That's a ratio of 3:1:1. I prefer a 3:1:2, so we could add a little more potassium at the end. But this is pretty close. So we're going to fertilize like this, and we're going to fertilize every time we water. I don't know why people have this habit of not fertilizing their houseplants. You want to fertilize every time you water. If we go back a ways with orchids, it was very common to tell people when you fertilize, you use a low amount of fertilizer and you fertilize very infrequently. I don't know where that advice came from. I gave it out for years before I learned better. It's dumb advice. Orchids need to be fertilized just like every other house plant. They want about 100 ppm nitrogen, and they want to be fertilized every time you water. It's as simple as that. Now, if you skip the odd time, that's fine, but they don't like to go for a long period of time without the fertilizer. Now, I mentioned very quickly that you want 100 ppm nitrogen. If you caught that, you're probably going, well, what the heck is that, and how do I figure that out? Well, I have a website called gardenmist.com, and I actually made a calculator on there to figure out what the ppm nitrogen is. It's something that gardeners need to start doing. Okay, this idea of using tablespoons doesn't work. Right? So I go online and lots of people say, well, how much fertilizer do you use? And they respond, oh, I use a 1/4 teaspoon. And the person says, oh, great, okay, I'll use a 1/4 teaspoon. You need 3 pieces of information to know what's going on. You need to know how much you're putting in, the 1/4 teaspoon. You need to know the NPK of the fertilizer because that tells you how much is in the bottle. And you need to know how much you're mixing up. Are you making up a gallon or 100 milliliters or a bucket or whatever? You need all 3 pieces of information, and no one ever gives all 3 pieces of information. On the other hand, if you say, I use 100 ppm nitrogen, everybody knows what you're doing, and they can make up using their own fertilizers with different NPKs, make up different amounts. you'll all end up with 100 ppm. The problem is it's a little hard to calculate for most people. So I put this special calculator together. So you just enter what you have, and it calculates it for you. It tells you how to make it up. All right, so 100 ppm nitrogen and ratio of 3:1:2. This is actually what I use, Miracle-Gro. I know some people hate Miracle-Gro, but it's an inexpensive fertilizer. It's a general plant fertilizer. It's not for orchids, but again, that doesn't matter. And if we look at the small print there, it's a 24:8:16, which just happens to be a 3:1:2 ratio, which is exactly what we want. And this particular product has the micronutrients in it, so this works well. All right, humidity. I mentioned earlier that orchids like to grow in greenhouses because they have this extra humidity. And for most homes, particularly in the wintertime, our home is too dry for orchids. They aren't really happy. So we'd like to give them a little more humidity. Now that doesn't mean you need more, but they would prefer more. Some people try to put them into terrariums, and that's the picture on the left there. This poor orchid is almost certainly going to die. They like more humidity, but in a situation like that, they're extremely difficult to water because if they're too wet, they will rot the roots and the plant will die. So don't do that. Never put them inside a closed container. Orchids used to be grown that way 150 years ago before people learned how to grow them, but we don't do that today. On the right is another solution. So here's an orchid and it's sitting on a pebble tray. And this is recommended for all kinds of house plants that need higher humidity. Put them on a pebble tray. Pebble trays don't work. Okay, the humidity is higher around the pebble tray. So if you go up an inch or two above the pebble tray, humidity is higher. By the time you get to the top of the pot where you start seeing leaves, the humidity is the same as in the rest of the room. Pebble trays do not work. Misting also doesn't work. Misting works for a few minutes while the leaves are wet, and then the leaves dry, and then the humidity is back to where it was. The only way to raise humidity is to raise it in the whole room. So you can get a humidifier and add humidity to it. But quite honestly, most orchids will be fine without that. So you don't have to go out of your way to give them more humidity. Just understand that they would actually prefer that, but you don't need to do anything special for it. Light is the other important one. And as a general statement, orchids need more lights than your other houseplants. Now, obviously, there are other houseplants that like more light, but a lot of our houseplants are specifically selected because they will grow in low light conditions, which is what we have in our home. Now, we look at this nice set of orchids growing on this window, and they seem very happy. And we look at this window and we say, boy, what a lot of light do we have here. Well, our eyes are really bad at figuring out how much light we have. So this looks bright to us, but this may not be a very bright situation for the plants. Now, because they're all flowering there, and this is a picture I took off the internet, I assume they're getting enough light. The direction of the window is very important, right? If this is an east or north facing window, they're not going to get so much light. If it's south or west facing, they're going to get more light. And of course, that's for northern hemisphere. You want to give them a very bright location. And we're going to go through some different types of orchids, and some need very high light. The Phalaenopsis that most people grow, we consider them low light orchids, but compared to your other house plants, they're actually high light plants, if that makes sense, okay? So if you want your Phalaenopsis to bloom more and grow well, give them as much light as you can. But they will grow just fine on a windowsill that's facing east or south. The other option, of course, is to grow them under lights. And we now have really good LED lights. They can be very strong lights. I have some LED lights now that give as much light as sunlight. When I first read that, I thought, no, that can't be true. Can't possibly be true. But it turns out it is. We have very powerful grow lights now. Now, you don't need that kind of light. You can get away with LED shop lights. There are some good LED grow lights. I'm going to give you a link near the end of my YouTube channel. I've got a dozen or more videos about lighting and selecting lights and understanding particularly LED lights. If you're going out to buy a new light system, don't consider anything else other than LEDs. But it'll walk you through some of the myths about LED lights and what you might select. I see pictures like this. These are pretty much useless. Okay, there's very little light coming from this thing, and it's not going to grow orchids, and it's certainly not going to grow the cactus that are sitting behind them. Cactus are very high light plants, and they're not going to be happy like this. Here's something else that's very popular on Amazon. There's all kinds of these little lights. These are toys. They're not real grow lights. They're showing a picture here of these two lights and a whole bunch of different plants. If you know some of these plants, you'll know that the size is all incorrect here. They don't fit under these lights. In fact, what I did was I have a video where I went out and actually bought a number of these cheap lights and actually tested them, measured the amount of light coming out of them, and I compare various types just to show people how poor these lights really are. They shouldn't be called grow lights. All right, temperature. In general, we can take all the orchids and classify them in three different categories. We have the cool growers, the intermediate growers, and the warm growers. The cool growers are not particularly happy in our homes. Our homes tend to be too warm for them. So I'm going to steer you away from those. The intermediate ones, they would actually still like to be a little cooler than our homes, but they can get by in our homes. And the warm growers is really the sweet spot there. The important thing to notice on here too is that they want a different temperature at night than during the day. Now, a lot of plants like this, but orchids really benefit from this. So they want to be a little warmer during the day and then cool down during the night. And then warmer during the day and cool down during the night. So you have this range of temperatures. Now, that's pretty hard to give them in most homes. If you're near a window in the wintertime, of course, it drops a bit at night. If you turn your thermostats down, it drops a little bit. So they get some variation, but in our homes, they don't usually get enough variation to make them super happy. But our homes are fine for growing most orchids. They will do fairly well even if they don't get this drop in temperature. Where the drop in temperature becomes really important is when you try to flower them. So I can take most of these orchids and grow them at a warmer temperature, and they'll grow just fine, but they won't flower. Phals, popular houseplants, they need a drop in temperature. So in the fall, you have to give them a little lower temperature and they'll flower. You don't have to do anything crazy. Just put them near a window. I'm going to talk about phals a little bit later, about some things I do. If you have a phal that's growing and you've had it for a couple of years and it's never flowered, but it seems to be growing well, there are really two reasons that it's not flowering. One is you're not fertilizing enough. The second one, you're not giving it a drop in temperature. They need that drop in temperature. Here's a phal that's making a flower spike, and all these orchids will make these long flower spikes, and they all grow towards the light. And now if you're under LED lights, they tend to grow up, which is great. If you're in a windowsill, they tend to grow towards the window. And so it's a good idea to stake these as they're growing. Don't wait until they're fully grown and the buds are open. It's too late then. You got to stake them as soon as they go up. Now on the left here is what I've done for years. It's the poor man's stake. And I just use some twist ties and put them around, and as the stem gets taller and taller, I just put a new twist tie on. A few years ago, I bought these little clips, and you can get a bag of them from Amazon for a fairly good price, and they're wonderful. You just squeeze them and put them around, and they're great. So for years, I told people you don't need the clips, but I really like the clips now that I have them. But you do need to stake them. Otherwise, these stems will just head off in whatever direction they want to go, and you want to direct them where you want to go. Once an orchid is finished flowering, again, we're talking about Phalaenopsis here, a lot of people leave that flower stem. And the reason they do that is that sometimes they will make side branches and flower again, which makes people very happy. I tend to cut it off. At this point, the flowers are finished, and this poor plant has been supporting these flowers for 6 months. That's a lot of drain on the plant. So what I like to do is to cut them off, give the plant a rest, let it grow a little bit, and then they'll reflower. So I tend to cut them off. Big question. What's the difference between a root and a flower stem? So you've got your first orchid and you're waiting for it to flower, and every little growth that comes out, you're hoping is a stem, and it turns out just to be roots. So on the left, we have some roots. On the right, we have flower stems, or what we call shoots. And you can sort of see the difference there. The roots are almost always round at the tip. You have this green part, and behind that is this white part. On the right side, the shoot comes out round, but then it gets quite flat. If you look at the tip, it's a flat, straight line, whereas on the root, it's a round circle if we look right at the tip. I do a video to show you the difference. Once you've seen the two, they're pretty easy to recognize. Pests can be a problem, but not a lot of problems. The main things orchid get are mealybugs and scale. I treat both of those with a baby oil spray. So I make up, it's mostly water with a bit of oil in there, and I use baby oil because it's a light oil. You don't want a heavy cooking type oil. You want a nice light oil. It also smells nice. You put a couple drops of soap in there, you shake it up, and you spray them, and it works quite well. And when I had a large collection, I would just go through the collection every 3 months and spray everything, and that kept both of these problems under control. Other than that, they don't get a lot of other pests. They generally don't get fungus gnats because there's too much air in the pot. The larvae don't like living there. This is a screenshot of the video that I have about making up the mealybug spray. There are a lot of other diseases that orchids get. Notably, they get a lot of viruses. The good news is that viruses are really only a problem if you have a larger collection of older plants. If you're going to the nursery or a grocery store and you're buying a new orchid, you're very unlikely to find a virus. But we used to have a collection at McMaster University that was like 50 years old and had some really old plants, and they did get some viruses from time to time. So generally you can ignore all of these fungal diseases. They're really not a problem in orchids. So the other big question is, what do we grow them in? And this is a hotly debated. You've got a bunch of different things here, and I'm going to simplify all this for you. If you can get real bark, that's great. And we used to always grow all the orchids in straight bark. You don't need perlite in there, you don't need sphagnum moss, just straight bark. And then bark became hard to get, at least in our part of the country. I think on the West Coast, it's still readily available. It also became extremely expensive. So most of us switched over to coconut husk. So this is coconuts that are chopped up into chunks. You want the chunky stuff, not the milled stuff. So coconut chunks. And it works just as well as the bark. That's readily available. You can buy them online. You can buy them from anybody who's selling orchids, generally has it. And that's the medium I use. I don't put anything else in there. So there's lots of talk online about different mixtures. You put a little charcoal in there, a little perlite in there, etc. Peat moss is another one. People like to put a little bit of peat moss. You don't need any of that. I grew in straight bark for the first 25 years of my life, and then I switched over to coconut chunks, and it's straight coconut chunks. That's it. The plants really don't care as long as they get lots of air and the material holds a bit of moisture. They're happy. What about sphagnum moss? It's something I personally really hate, but many of the orchids you buy now are grown in sphagnum because the orchid growers, particularly ones who grow phals, they grow them in huge amounts and they love sphagnum moss. Now you have to understand that these guys have huge greenhouses and controlled systems and automated watering, and they watch these things like a hawk and make sure they're treated perfectly. And they grow fine in sphagnum moss. Most of the ones you buy are in sphagnum moss. So you bring them home and then you start watering them. And sphagnum moss, if it gets too dry, it doesn't wet well. So it's hard to get wet again. and it stays too wet in the home. So a lot of people, I think, have problems with these orchids because they stay in sphagnum moss, and it's just really hard to water. I've tried it, and I just find it difficult. It works. A lot of people use it, but you have to be really, really careful with your watering. And as I've said, watering is the biggest issue for most people. I get them out of that sphagnum as quickly as possible. If I buy a new orchid, even if it's in flower, I will repot it right away because I don't trust sphagnum moss. The kind of pot you use isn't that important. For most of my life, I've used the green standard pots on the left there. Clay pots used to be very popular, but aren't really necessary. And I just published an article about 2 weeks ago about these clear pots. So there is some new science out that suggests the clear pots may be a little better than the opaque pots. The problem with the clear pots is that algae builds up in them, and so that can become a problem. So if you're buying a new pot, I would probably buy the clear pot. If you have some existing pots, just use whatever you have. They're not that fussy. You do not need special orchid pots, and there's lots of those on the market. They're all fairly expensive. You don't need that. The orchid doesn't care. Here's another way of growing orchids, and this works great in greenhouses. These are these wooden slats. Doesn't work in the home because we're just too dry in the home, so don't use those. Another technique that is becoming popular online for some strange reason is to grow them in water. And I've tried this. It just doesn't work. And most people who try it end up going back to something else. I think the appeal here is that a lot of people know that there's a lot of house plants that they can take cuttings from, stick it in water, and they root and grow in water. So they figure, well, why not the orchids? But remember, orchids like to be dry. They don't like to be in water. So again, there's some people who are very successful with this. I was talking to someone at the American Orchid Society, and I asked her, what do you think about this new water culture technique? And she kind of stared at me and said, what the hell are you talking about? And so I explained it to her, and she says, nobody does that. And I said, well, yeah, there's a whole group online who like this. So stay away from this, unless you just like to experiment. So I'm going to paste in some links into the discussion. And there's a couple videos. One is on repotting. Another one is on getting rid of that sphagnum moss. And the third one, I think, is on flowering orchids. So I'll paste the links into the discussion, and you can get them there. So let's look at some other orchids here. Cattleyas are very popular. These are the corsage orchids. They're beautiful plants. They generally flower once a year. My biggest complaint about these, if I can call it a complaint, is that the flowers last about 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. So you're growing this plant all year, you get a spectacular bloom for 2 weeks, and then they're done. And they need a little more light than you'll get on a windowsill. Fantastic plants, though. So if you have lights and you want to do something a little special, get yourself some of these guys. There's thousands of these available. Different shapes, colors, sizes. These are the Phalaenopsis, or what we call the phals. This is what I would recommend most people start with. They come in sort of two basic shapes. There's these larger ones, and these flowers are, well, let's call them 3-4 inches across. They're quite large flowers. And then there's the smaller ones, and they're grown the same way. The advantage of the smaller ones is that they tend to branch more, and they flower for a long time. So I had one of these little purple guys here on the left, and I had it in flower for 2 full years constantly. By the time one stem was finished, it was making side branches, and then a second stem would come, and so on. And these are the smaller ones. The larger flowered ones will give you one set of flowers, but it lasts 6 months. And so by that time, you're kind of tired of it anyway. So that's almost as good. But if you really want long flowering, go for the smaller flowers. This is what they would look like in nature. They grow in trees. The leaves hang down. The flowers hang down. Just fantastic looking plant. And again, they come in lots and lots of different colors. The paphs or paphliopetalums, I don't see a lot for sale in our neck of the woods. You would have to go to an orchid specialty nursery to get these. Flowers last for about 2 months, so they're pretty good, and you get several of them coming, so you have something in flower for 3 months of the year. Pretty easy to grow, lower light. So they're like the phals, so they will grow well in a house. So this is another good choice. These are all in the same group of plant. Miltoniopsis are kind of nice plants, but these are cool growers. They really don't like our homes very much. So I would tend to stay away from them, but they're fantastic plants. And they're pretty easy to grow, but you can't put them in a warm room. Cymbidiums, these orchids are a little different in that they like to be outside for the summer. They need lots of light, and then they need a cool spell in the fall. So what most people do is they'll leave them in their garden, even let a bit of frost touch their leaves, and that's what initiates flowering. Then they bring them in the house, and then they'll flower for around Christmas time. But if you try to keep these only in the home, they're not going to do well for you. They're also larger plants, so these things are 2, 3 feet tall. They get quite a bit wider and so on. So they're not as great of a house plant unless you have that garden to grow them in for the summer. Um, this is a dendrobium. Yeah, you won't grow this in the house. These are these people who grow in Florida and in warm climates where they're outside all the time. Very jealous of these. But they're still great plants. So this is what the dendrobium looks like in a home. They grow quite well. They do like a little more light than the average orchid. They're fairly easy to grow, fairly easy to flower, and the flower lasts for about a month. That's another dendrobium. Oncidiums are very much like the orchid, the corsage orchid. They're a little harder to grow. They need more light. Again, I would probably stay away from these unless you have a good sunny spot or you're going to grow them under light. If you want to get in touch with me, here's the best way to contact me. I have a YouTube channel, a Facebook group, and a podcast, and they're all called Garden Fundamentals. The YouTube channel has over 600 videos there. There are probably 30 different ones on orchids, many on soils, many on general gardening, all kinds of topics. We have a Facebook group called Garden Fundamentals that you're welcome to join. I'm on there every day, so myself and other people will be answering your questions. And then I've also started a podcast called Garden Fundamentals. My main blog site is called gardenmyths.com, and there are over 700 articles there, all kinds of different topics about gardening. As you see, Garden Myths, what I like to do is look at information that we think we know about gardening, and then figure out what's really going on. Like these pots for orchids, for instance. So I've been telling people for years that they can just use an opaque pot, and now there's some very recent science, it's only a couple years old, that says, well, clear pots do have some advantages. And so I made an article about that. And I like to look at other gardening myths like that. If you're interested in growing tomatoes, I have a free ebook available. If you go to gardenmyths.com, you'll find it on the right-hand side of the page. It's 75 pages, gives you everything you need to know about growing tomatoes. It's perfectly free. It's a PDF, so you just download it and use it. I've also written a number of books. Two of my books are Garden Myths, Book 1 and Book 2. Each one is completely different and has about 120 myths in it. If you're going to come to any of the in-person events in Guelph, I'll have the books there. If you're not in the Guelph area or can't attend to those meetings, they're all available on Amazon. My latest book is called Food Science for Gardeners, and this is not so much a how to grow plant, but how to grow book. It's about nutrition. What is nutritious food? How do we keep it nutritious? What about pesticides, microplastics? How do we cook the food so we retain the nutrition in the food? So all about food. And there's a couple chapters in there about growing nutritious food as well. Oh, and by the way, it did this a few months ago. It won a gold award in the home and garden category for best book 2025. I have a number of other books available. So one on soils, another microbes, compost, plant science, and building natural ponds. These are all available from Amazon. Or if you go to my website and use that link there, it'll actually take you directly to my publisher. And if you use that discount code, you get a 25% off the publisher's price. So whichever method is easiest for you. And again, if you're seeing me anywhere this spring, I'll have these books with me. Do you provide the proportion of the size of pot to plant size? Oh, I do. I discussed that in the video. You don't want to go too big. Use a pot where the plant roots fit in it, and it's not too big. And the reason is we want it to dry out, right? If we use a large pot, it stays wet too long. So a small pot rarely harms the plant. An oversized pot can lead to rotting roots. So if you're in doubt at all, go small. When you get side branches, do you prune the older parts back? So I'm not quite sure what side branches you're talking about. But we have two types of growth. So the one is the sympodia, where they're growing along in a straight line. Once you have a lot of growth, you can actually cut that in half and turn it into two plants. Sometimes when they're growing along, they will actually branch and make two new growths, new tips. And so then you get this Y-shaped growth. And then what I would do is leave it for a couple years, and then you can split off one of those sides. Now, the other thing that does happen, particularly with Phalaenopsis, is that they will make a flower spike up, start making some flowers, and then sometimes make a side branch on there. Okay? If it's a side branch that's another flower spike, you can't cut that off because there's no roots. It won't survive. So you just leave it. The other thing phals do sometimes is that they will make little baby plants on that flower spike. It's something we call a kiki. So it will come up, and initially you won't know it's a real plant, but eventually you'll see these leaves, and it's pretty obvious it's a baby plant. Leave it on there. Okay. Eventually it makes roots, and once it has 2 or 3 good-sized roots, you can just cut it off and pot it up, and you've got a new plant. Can we place phals outside all summer? Absolutely. In fact, they love it. Our homes really don't give them enough light. So what I used to do is I'd take my plants out. I had a sunroom. They would go outside, but you have to do that slowly, right? It's like taking your tomato seedlings outside. You take them out the first day and for an hour, and then you put them back in the inside, or put it in a shady area. And then a couple of days later, you give them 2 hours, and then 3 hours. Because if you put them outside right away, you will burn the leaves. Okay? It won't kill the plant, but it disfigures them. And because orchids have these leaves on for many years, you have a disfigured leaf for many years. So be very careful how you get them out there, but a little bit of more sun every day. Once they're out there, they can take, in zone 5, they can take full sun. Okay, if you're in a warmer climate, you might want to put them in some part shade. But in my area, I'll put them outside to get full afternoon sun. And the leaves will go from a nice green, deep green color to an almost yellow color. Okay. So now we have this light green color, and that's what the leaves should actually look like, okay? Now this plant has gotten so much light that it almost certainly flowers when you bring it in the fall, okay? So absolutely great to put them outside. Do you use regular water for watering? Well, that's a tricky question because that really depends on what your tap water is. So ideally, they like soft water, right? So they'd love rainwater if you can give it to them. We live in an area that has very hard water, so we actually use water softeners to soften our water for the house. Okay? Now that goes through a salt system, so we replace the calcium and magnesium with salt, sodium. That's not good for plants. Okay? It won't actually kill them, but it's not great for plants. So I tend to use water that comes from before the water softener. Now, that's hard water, and so that's better. But what I like to do is I mix it. I mix it about 50-50 with rainwater if I have it. So I take my very hard water, take about half rainwater, mix those two together, put in my fertilizer, and that's just about right. That gives them some calcium, some magnesium, but it's not real hard. If your water is too hard, you will tend to see white caking on the top of the soil. It's that scale that you get in coffee pots and so on. Okay, that's not great for plant roots, and particularly for orchids. They're a little sensitive to that salt buildup. So ideally, you want soft water, but don't take it from a water that's been softened with salt. All right, so do you need to let the water sit before putting it on the orchids? So this is a very common question, one of those myths that I deal with on Garden Myths. So people say, okay, well, we have chlorine in our water. That's harmful for plants. So I take my water and I put it in jugs and I let it sit for 24 hours and then it's safe for plants. That's partially correct. So chlorine can damage your plants. But the amount of chlorine in our water is so low, it doesn't harm plants. So there's no benefit for sitting for 24 hours, okay? Now, they probably don't like really cold water out of your cold tap either, but it won't kill them. So if the water is really cold coming out, you might want to let it sit for a few minutes to warm up a little bit. But you don't have to sit. You don't have to let the water sit. There's no real benefit. And this goes for any house plants, not just orchids. Okay, the chlorine won't hurt them. The fluoride won't hurt them. The levels are far too low. Letting it sit out is not going to reduce the hardness. So you're really not improving anything about that water for houseplants, except maybe warming it up. What do you do about roots outside the pot? Nothing. Okay, that's the way orchids grow. Now, it's interesting, and I mentioned that I just wrote that article about the clear pots, and most producers of orchids now use clear pots. And one of the main reasons is that if you use clear pots, the orchid makes less roots outside of the pot. They tend to stay in the pot because they get a bit of light through that clear pot. And that's the main reason that the commercial outlets use clear pots, right? For the homeowner, they go outside, that's okay, they're fine, they wander around. Orchids, that's what orchids do. If they're starting to grow and they're growing out, sometimes you can kind of push them in a little bit, encourage them to go down into the bark. But if they grow outside, just leave them. Next time when you repot, oh, by the way, you should repot every 2 years without fail. Okay, it's real simple. Every 2 years, repot. And in fact, we usually write the date of repotting right on the plant tag, because a year and a half from now, you won't remember when you repotted it, right? So put the date on. Now you know 2 years later, you repot. When you repot, you take all these roots that are now outside the pot and you push them into the pot and start them over again. And then over time, they'll make more roots outside. So that's fine. How do you soak when the healthy silver green, not brown, and shriveled roots are short above the substrate? Well, so I think the question is, if these roots are growing outside of the substrate, outside of the media, how do they get watered because they're out in the air? If those are the only roots the orchid has, then I would repot it and get them down deeper. They're too high up. So now you've got roots in the media. If you have good roots in the media and some of them are outside, don't worry about it. Okay? If you're trying to rescue a plant, so you've had this orchid and you didn't grow it quite right and you've lost a lot of roots and only has a few roots left and they're outside, you can spray them. Okay? And what happens with these orchid roots is when they're dry, they're a silvery white color. When they're wet, they go green. So you can spray them, you'll see them going green. That means that they're absorbing water, and that will help. But you do need some of these roots in the media. Okay, if they're all above, then you have a problem. I would repot the orchid deeper, and then you'll have some covered with bark. Kind of an aside issue, these roots look very thick. Most of what you're seeing is not the root. The root is actually quite thin and it's inside. And that silvery white thing is a coating. It's called velamen. And it's like a big sponge that surrounds the root. And it's there because in nature, remember, these things are growing on trees. So it's sitting there in full sun, it's really dry, it hasn't rained for days, and suddenly you get a bit of rain. These roots are like sponges, they just soak it up, and then they hold that water around the inner root. Okay, and that's why they have this spongy material. So if you spray that and it goes green, you now know that the sponge is full of water. When I do the soaking watering method, do I put the fertilizer right in the water? Yeah, when I water houseplants, anything, I don't water with water. I always water with fertilizer in it. It's not a two-step process. There were some suggestions years ago about, oh, you have to water the orchid first and get all the roots green, and then you put the fertilizer on. That's complete nonsense. In fact, I have another article on garden myths that talks about orchid myths, and that's one of them. You don't want to water and then fertilize. Okay. Remember, I just described this sponge. So what happens is I water it, the sponge soaks up all the water, and now it's full of water. And now I come along with my fertilizer and put the fertilizer on. Well, guess what? The sponge is full. So the fertilizer just runs through the pot. You have to add the fertilizer along with the water because we want the fertilizer and water going into that sponge. So you want them there at the same time. If my potting media is all floating away, does that mean I have put it in too loose? Sort of. What it probably means is that when you put that pot into water, your water level's too high. Okay? So when we sink this pot into water, we don't want the water to go much above where the media is. If you do, it will float and float out of the pot. When you're repotting these, you do press it in a little bit, but it's not really held in there very tightly. So a newly potted plant, if you put it into water that's twice as deep as the pot, the whole thing will just float to the surface. Okay, so the trick is just don't put it into as much water. Do you trim roots in a heavy way, trimming off dead or black roots? So if you've never repotted an orchid, watch the video because I go through all those steps, all right? But in general, when I repot an orchid, I take it out, I get all the old media off because it's 2 years old now and I don't want to reuse it for orchids. You could use it for other houseplants, but not for orchids. It's starting to break down. So now I can see the root system. The next thing I do is I cut off any dead roots. So roots don't live forever, so they will die. I cut all those off. Anything that's mushy, they get cut off. Remember particularly our phals, they're monopodial, so they get higher. So at the very base of this thing, the roots die because that's an old plant. The leaves go higher and higher, but the roots also go higher and higher. Okay, so the bottom part is usually dead. I cut that off. I cut off all the old roots, and then when I repot, I sink it in deeper than it was before. Remember, it's sympodial. It's monopodial. It's growing taller. So each time I repot, it goes deeper and deeper into the pot. But yeah, cut off anything that's dead. Once the root is dead, it's not going to do anything for the plant, so you might as well cut it all off. Is it okay to keep the pot with drainage inside? Yes, there's nothing wrong with that. What you don't want is to have water sitting inside that outer pot. Okay, the orchid should never sit in water except for that 15 minutes when you're watering it. I have a plant that is just sending out some branches that I believe will be flowering, but it also has some kind of fungus on the roots. It's fluffy and kind of looks like styrofoam balls. Okay, orchids almost never get a fungus. So if you see fluffy fungus, it's probably not a fungus. It almost sounds like you're describing mealybugs. Okay, mealybugs are little white balls, not quite balls, but almost balls, and they're kind of fuzzy. Okay, particularly when they get older, they clump together, and so you get this white coating. I'm going to guess that that's what you have. Okay, so what I would do is look up mealybugs, make sure you ID them properly. So they're pretty distinct, so you'll know right away whether you have them. And then if they are, treat for the mealybugs. I'm going to guess that's what you have. All right. Some of the leaves have turned purple, tinged, and wrinkled. Okay, let me describe to you pictures I see almost every day on Facebook in the orchid group. There's a group called something like My First Orchid or something. Every day someone posts a picture and they say, "What's wrong with my plant?" And you'll see this Phalaenopsis. You'll see these nice leaves that are now all wrinkled and bending down. So instead of being nice up, they're leaning over, they're wrinkled. And the question is, what's wrong with my orchid? The answer is one of two things. One, you haven't watered it for 2 months, which is highly unlikely. And the second one is you've rotted the roots. Okay? And you really can't tell the difference between those two conditions by looking at the plant. Remember, this isn't the plant I have in front of me. This is just a picture on the internet. Both conditions look the same. And the reason is that both conditions mean the plant, the leaves, are not getting water. When plant roots rot, the plant can't absorb water, so the top part, the green part, dries out. If I don't water my plant, the roots can't absorb any water and the top part of my plant dries out. So the symptoms are identical for those two problems. I just know most people water their houseplants, and so it's almost certainly rotten roots. So what you should do is take it out of the pot, have a look at the root system, and I think as soon as you pull it out of that pot, you'll know right away what the problem is. Okay? And I can pretty much guess that 98% of these pictures I see, they've been overwatered, the roots are rotten, the plant's not getting any moisture. So now what do you do? It really depends on how far gone the plant is and how valuable it is to you. If it's in really bad shape, I would pitch it and buy another one. If it's really valuable to you, you can fix the problem because these orchids are hard to kill. So I would repot it. Then I would be very careful how I water it. I would make sure it dries out really well. It will start making new roots and it will recover. But now it's going to take 2 years before it flowers, right? It's probably lost some leaves by now. It's lost the whole root system. It's going to have to regrow and get larger again before it will flower. And you have to ask yourself, is that worth the effort? So I think in a lot of cases, you might want to pitch the thing and start over. But that's the real problem. So the minute I see wrinkled leaves, even a purple tinge, it's not getting water into the leaves, and I'm going to guess it's missing roots. If moving orchids to a greenhouse for the summer months, is there anything to be cautious of other than gradual light increase? It's mostly the light. They're pretty tough plants, so ideally you don't have big temperature swings when you do that, but that won't kill an orchid. They're rugged. They can get 20-degree change in temperature, that's fine. Most orchids cannot take frost, so you don't even want to get anywhere near frost, right? I would say 10 degrees centigrade or 10 degrees above freezing, you're fine. Other than that, I wouldn't worry too much about it. But you have to remember, these plants, if they've been in the house, are in a low light condition. Remember that window I showed you? It looks so bright, but compared to the light outside, it's really dark. We live in caves, and the orchid can't go from that situation to full sun. That will do a lot of damage. If you have a new flower spike coming off an old flower spike, should I prune the tip of the old back? Well, the plant doesn't care what you do. Okay, you can trim the old one back, you can not trim it back, you can leave side branches. Once the flower stem starts going brown, it's not coming back. So once it's brown, you can cut it off. As long as it stays green, a lot of people leave them in the hopes that it makes a side branch or maybe makes a kiki. Personally, I find that once they've been flowering for 6 months, I'm kind of sick of the thing anyways. So I just cut it off, give it a rest. And for the health of the plant, that's probably the right answer. Okay, these orchids literally will flower, year after year after year, and they don't grow as well then. So my philosophy is it's done its job. I've enjoyed it for 6 months. Cut the thing off, give it a rest, let it grow some leaves, let it get bigger, and I'll have more flowers next year. Okay. But I don't think the orchid really cares that much. It's up to you. I was told cymbidiums are heavy feeders. They are. Cymbidiums can be difficult to flower. They do need a very cold period in the fall. Okay, they need high light. They need almost frost in the fall. It's the only orchid, like houseplant orchid, that I would let get frost. And I'm not talking about heavy frost, but a touch of frost on the leaves is good. A lot of people keep them outside and then bring them in after that first frost. But yeah, lots of light, lots of fertilizer. They're a little tricky. That's why they're not really houseplants, but they're not overly difficult to grow either. After flowers are done, how far back do you cut the old flower spike? I think we discussed that. It's really up to you. Some people leave it. I cut them off. Could we melt clean snow? Yes, you can do that. So snow is just like rainwater. It has very few minerals in it, so you can do that. Just understand that, a foot of snow gives you very little water. Okay, it's amazing. Like you go out and you say, God, we got a big snowstorm, and you fill a pail with snow and you melt it down and you've got like 1.5 inches of water in there. You may not want to do that for very long. Reverse osmosis works. So reverse osmosis takes everything out of the water. The problem is that water is now too pure. Okay, so this gets a little complicated, but I said I have hard water. It's hard because there's a lot of calcium and magnesium in there, and plants need lots of calcium and magnesium. Most water has a fair amount of calcium and magnesium. So most fertilizer does not include calcium and magnesium because they know 95% of the people use their tap water and it has enough, so they don't have to add it to the fertilizer. So now you go and you use a reverse osmosis and you create very pure water with no calcium and magnesium. And you use the regular fertilizer, so now you have no calcium and magnesium, and so you're starving your plants. So you can use reverse osmosis water. You can mix it, 50-50 back with your hard water, or you can buy a fertilizer that has the calcium and magnesium in it. Okay, but you have to be careful that you do that. You have to add that back into the reverse osmosis water somehow. And probably the easiest way is just to mix your water 50-50. It also means that your water is going to go longer, right? So 1/2 reverse osmosis, and this really depends on your water, right? So if you have fairly soft water and you use reverse osmosis and you mix them together, you still have very soft water. Right. I know that with my water, I actually went to the city and said, well, how much calcium and magnesium is in my water? And they will tell you that. And then you can calculate how much you want. Now, I can't do that off the top of my head, but I have an article about that. So I figured out that if I use 1/3 house water, hard water, 2/3 rainwater, I end up with the right amount of calcium and magnesium. Okay. But you have to go through that calculation. I can't tell you that because it really depends on what your house water is like. Where did the myth about using ice cubes come from? I wondered if somebody would ask that. So there's a company out there that promoted this idea that said when you don't water your orchids, just put 1 or 2 ice cubes on the orchid once a week. And when I first heard that, I thought, well, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Orchids are tropical. They like warm temperatures. The last thing they want is ice cubes on their roots. This makes no sense whatsoever. Well, it turns out 4 or 5 years ago, a researcher actually tested the ice cubes, and they do not do damage to the roots. And the reason is that this velamen layer, this sponge, keeps the root, which is inside, it keeps it warm enough from the ice cube. So the ice doesn't damage the inside root. It does damage leaves. So you don't want to get the ice touching the leaves. It's too cold. And it actually works. And the reason it works is this. If I tell you to put an ice cube on your orchid once a week, you can do that and do it correctly. If I say, water your orchid once a week, but don't water too much, you don't know what that means. And so with the ice cubes, people don't overwater their orchids, And as a result, they grow well. Okay. So it's not something I would recommend, but it's something that can prevent you from overwatering if you're one of those people who just can't resist but pour water on your houseplants. Okay. It does actually work and it doesn't harm the roots. Okay, when you see the sticky honeydew, what do you do? So it depends on why you have the sticky honeydew. So if you have scale and particularly mealybugs, they actually produce a honeydew as well. Okay, so if you have scale and mealy and or mealybugs, you will find a sticky surface on your plants, and that's probably from the insect infestation. However, orchid leaves also make their own honeydew. And what's it called? It's not called honeydew. Can't remember what it's called. It has a special name. So what happens when the plant takes up too much water into the leaves, rather than burst, it actually lets some of it out along with the sugars from the leaves. And so it produces tiny little droplets, usually on the underside of the leaves. And that's perfectly natural. If you taste it, it is sweet. It's just this plant saying, you're giving me lots of water. I appreciate that, but I have a bit too much in my leaves, and so rather than burst, I'm going to let some of it out. So don't worry about it. You can clean it off because sometimes you will get a black mold growing on that honey because it is sweet and there are sugars in it. But it's natural for the plant to do that. How to properly water Phalaenopsis? The media is different as it has been a bit heavier, same way as you meant. Okay, so what you do is, let's go back to water. You cannot overwater a plant, any plant. When you water, water lots. Okay, if it's in the right kind of media, the right kind of potting media, you can't overwater it. The problem is people water too often. So the trick is water all you want and then leave it alone until it's perfectly dry. If you follow that, it doesn't matter what media you have. Okay, it can be sphagnum moss, it can be bark, it can be coconut chunks, it can have perlite in there. It doesn't really matter. You can't actually overwater plants at the time you're watering it. It's the frequency and the frequency of repeating the water that causes the problem. So the same watering method works for any kind of potting media. Can you use any type of tree bark? Probably. I would use one that's sold for orchids. I have tried wood chips, and they don't grow very well in wood chips. So I'm sure there's some kinds of bark that are not as good, but if it's for orchids, it will be fine. I have gnats, all my house plants and plants. Okay, so this person has gnats everywhere. So first of all, make sure you actually have fungus gnats because there are also fruit flies and there's drain flies which kind of look the same. So whenever you have any kind of pest, make sure you identify it first. Don't spray things, don't apply things, don't treat things. I see that as one of the biggest mistakes online. People kind of know they have something, someone gives them a recommendation and they go off and do it. Okay, identify the pest. So you've identified it, you're sure you have fungus gnats. What do you do about it? It sort of depends on where you live, to be honest. So the yellow sticky sheets, they work a little bit because they catch the flies, but they won't catch them all. The best solution really is a systemic that you put in the pot. If you put a systemic in the pot, the larvae eat that systemic. They will be exposed to it and absorb it, and that will kill them, and it works really well. The problem is that if you're in Canada, you can't buy systemics, so you're out of luck. Fungus gnats in Canada can be very hard to deal with, especially on orchids. On other houseplants, one thing you can do is put on a layer of sand. The adult flies don't like laying their eggs in sand, so people put like a 1/4-inch layer of sand, and that works. They can still go in the holes at the bottom of the pot, but you'll get much less fungus gnats. You can dry out the plant. So the larvae need a certain amount of moisture to survive. If it's an orchid, just let it go dry for 2 weeks and your fungus gnats are gone out of that pot. Now, the other thing you have to remember is fungus gnats is an insect that has a life cycle. So you're probably seeing the flies, Okay, they laid eggs. So if you get rid of the flies today, well, there's eggs in there that will hatch out in a week or two, and you'll have more fungus gnats. Okay, so you have to kind of treat these over a 3 to 4 week period to get rid of everything. But if you dry out that pot, the larvae will die, and that's why you generally don't see fungus gnats in orchids. But you do see them in most other houseplants because the potting media is much less porous and is moist. So again, if you go to either my YouTube channel or to the blog, there's an article on fungus gnats. I still use bark, but cannot get the big chunks anymore. I presume cocoa husks would be better than these smaller bits of bark. Yes. Yeah, you really want a good chunky thing. And coconut husk works great. I've been using coconut husk chunks, 20 plus years, and there's every bit as good as bark. Is leca suitable media? This is little pellets, clay type pellets. You can grow them in there. They are a bit more difficult, but some people really like it. You can still get mosquito dunks on Amazon. Yeah, for fungus gnats, you can use mosquito dunks. And that will work. You can find Reality Time on YouTube, Substack, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. I'll put links to these and our social pages in the description below. If you're interested in gardening, check out my YouTube channel called Garden Fundamentals or my blog called Garden Myths. Let the truth shine into your life.